So, what is new environmentalism? I like a session which has a question as its title, especially when it's a question I don't know the answer to. We have 4 speakers, all of whom I think come from different points of view. I'm not even sure what they all are. So I shall introduce them all, and then they can tell us what they have to say. I think that works as a format. So, immediately on my right, we have Joe Smith, who's an academic at the Open University. I've been calling him a geographer. Apparently that may not be quite right. I'm sure he'll put me right. But he has studied environmental history and politics. At the far end there, we have Caspar Hewitt, who is a Durham University Research Associate and also runs a thing called The Great Debate, which is in the northeast of England. And there's an event which I will plug you at the end, so to speak. Is that a verb? It is now. To my immediate left, we have Ben Pyle, who is an independent researcher, writer, blogger, prolific tweeter, and his blog is called Climate Resistance, which will probably give you a little idea of where he's coming from. And at the end here, we have Mark Linus, who is the author of The God Species and quite a prominent environmental thinker and subversive. Is that a fair description?
No, it's not.
No, he's not a subversive at all. He's a very orthodox environmentalist. You see, that shows you how little I know about the topic. And that's the order we're going to hear from them in. So, Joe Smith, start us off.
Thanks. We're invited to battle in a way that I'm not always comfortable with, but I'm going to turn up the volume in an attempt to fit the bill. So my first attempt to do that is to suggest that the problem with new environmentalism is that they think they're God. Where does this phrase come from? An environmentalist who I've always been a big fan of, Stuart Brand, suggested in 1968 that we are as gods and we might as well get good at it. This was in relation to his fantastic Whole Earth catalogue. There's a small shift in the grammar in 2009 when he suggests that we are as gods and have to get good at it. The naughty environmentalist habit of deploying disguised imperatives, I'm sure you've all spotted. In relation to ecosystem engineering, he suggests that beavers do it, earthworms do it. They don't usually do it at a planetary scale, but we have to do it at a planetary scale. A lot of the sentiments and aesthetics of the environment movement stand in the way of that. And I think that sentiment is at the core of the invitation that we've been given to debate new environmentalism. But the reason I find this is something of a kind of 3D straw man manufactory is that I think that the truth is actually that in global environmental change research demonstrates like nothing else that we are absolutely and resolutely not gods. On the contrary, I think it places us back among the animals. I think you could understand climate change research particularly as another line in Darwin's chapter. And it reminds us of our very modest role on the planet and the sense in which everything we do, but most spectacularly our economy, is dependent on our ecology. But I think that new-old distinction is in any case overdone. There's always been a diverse mix of technophile and romantic strands and many others in environmentalism. Some of us, myself included, embody both in one person. But the, I think, clumsy characterization of a broad body of thought and action in terms of this divergence also allows us, I think, to dismiss the achievements of what, for want of today's argument, we'll call old environmentalism. So there's a kind of, what would the Python team say? What would we say about what environmentalism has done for us? If you look across the fact that in the developed world we have cleaner water, cleaner air, we've got public access to what were previously private spaces, we've got treasured places and landscapes protected. The list could go on for a good 7 minutes. But I think that none of those people involved in organised environmentalism should give up the day job because they've all, in their member-supported, small contribution-funded organisations, have done really important work for us. However, I think that they have managed to give the impression that environmental change issues are their preserve. I think we should break that down and share this difficult new knowledge around climate change, biodiversity loss, resource depletion, the problems of urbanisation. There's an upside too, of course. That should be shared amongst us. We should not leave that set of topics to the environmental NGOs or a discrete research and policy community. And two ways I think that most simply we could respond to that. One is to work harder to connect our responses to biodiversity loss and climate change to questions about everyday quality of life. And that's something that I think the environmental NGOs have done startlingly little to achieve. The last time they campaigned explicitly on quality of life in cities in a broad sense is about 25 years, which I think is an astounding fact. It's a different story in the States, but still it's taken a while for them to engage with those sorts of issues in terms of the big formal NGOs. And secondly, I want to suggest that when we take this topic into mainstream politics, it's important that we do a great deal more to think about what a green political economy should be embedded within our anticipation of our vision for the future. Hence, rather than talk of putting a price on carbon, we need to set that within a conversation about ecological tax reform, which is offended by the fact that we put such high taxes on entrepreneurship or work, and yet we put such a low price or indeed subsidise fossil fuels. It's in these ways that I think that we can gather a decent working majority around the notion that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the Teague Report on Economics and Biodiversity have delivered not an inconvenient truth, but rather an inconvenient risk assessment. And we now need to collectively invest ourselves in the process of risk management. Thank you.
Marvellous. Look at you go with your just over 5 minutes. Good. You set a very good example there. Thank you, Joe. So, Caspar, what is new environmentalism?
I don't know. That's me done. Well, no. I think what I'd like to say, I mean, over the last 15 years, I've engaged deeply with environmental thought through my research, but more importantly, through the Great Debates, Development, Sustainability and Environment series, which has been conversations over a number of years, conversations and debates with those for and against environmentalism. Environmentalism never has been a single movement, of course. It's always been multi-stranded and covered a huge range of views from highly humanistic through to the utter misanthropism of deep green ideas. Now, engaging with this wealth of views has been a really valuable exercise over the years. Now, the blurb for this session rightly highlights a series of issues that have divided opinion both within and outside the environmental camp, so things like nuclear, genetic modification, fracking. Now, picking up the nuclear debate, I've pulled out an example. It's an article about a new Australian documentary, Pandora's Promise, which just came out this month. The article's entitled, "Greenies Can Be Pro-Nuclear." It looks at the shortfall in energy that we can expect if we're to reach carbon dioxide emissions targets and makes the case for nuclear energy. It's a familiar argument, and it's one that does deserve exposure because it's a real issue and difficult decisions need to be made about it. But I don't think it reflects a significant change in environmental philosophy. What is interesting, it does reflect two important changes that have taken place in recent years. The first, the more obvious of the two, is the shift in emphasis from pollution and limits to resources to climate change. The second is the shift from sustainability to resilience. And if you look at the recent literature, you'll find that resilience has appeared as the new buzzword. Now, environmentalists have always shifted the goalposts as our understanding and knowledge changes, and to an extent, that's fair enough. After all, once the hole in the ozone layer was solved, the problem with that by the ban on CFCs, there was no point continuing to campaign for that ban. Similarly with acid rain, these are actually real gains that were made by the environmental movement, echoing your point. There has been a tendency, however, in some quarters to fail to admit that some of the claims of the past have been simply wrong, and the limits to growth is the classic example of that. Now, a few years ago, I had some correspondence with Nordhaus and Schellenberger, who are mentioned in the blurb for this session. They felt that the Great Debate had been asking the right questions, and I think the same about them. They want the environmental movement to reinvent itself, and there's a reason for this. For them, as for many environmentalists, the big issue now is climate change. They argue that the traditional vision of environmentalists, in which the environment, in inverted commas, is thought of as a distinct thing, separate from humans, and open to technical solutions. They think that's a faulted one, which the movement needs to transcend. They argue for a move away from technical policy solutions to political ones, focusing on visions and values. I would probably argue the opposite, but they do rightly draw attention to the connection between environmental concerns and human ones. Their new Apollo project aimed to create something inspiring that would, in their own words, remind people of the American dream. What they think is distinctive about that vision is it's a move away from special interest environmentalism, in their words, towards one in which alliances can be formed with unions, civil rights groups, and businesses. This would be achieved through appealing to common interests in economic development aligned with strong action on climate change. I have a lot of sympathy for this idea, but I'm not convinced that they've moved very far, in that their central assumption about the importance of climate change remains unchanged. So, to engage with the questions posed for this session, what has driven the change? Well, one major thing is the economic crisis. It's inspired a new sense of dissatisfaction in all sectors of society, which is finding expression in the division and contradictions within the environmental movement. It raises fundamental questions about what we value. Do we want more for ourselves and other people? Why does the environment matter? What do we want to conserve and why? Now, these questions have always been there, and disagreements within the environmental movement over these matters have always been there. It's just that now they're at the forefront. The second question, what possibilities exist for new environmentalism to make a difference? Well, if we take the more pro-human elements of environmental thought, then the potential is huge. For example, the pro-nuclear lobby's recognition that we need to generate electricity is a good start point, whether or not they're right about nuclear in particular. For me, when we get people to buy into the idea of geoengineering, we'll be winning. We need to reject the paralysing view that human intervention in the environment is problematic. How often do we hear that it's human hubris that's the problem? I reject that absolutely. It seriously undermines our ability to solve problems. Now, to come to the last question posed, what do environmentalists think constitutes the good life? Well, I can't speak for them, but my idea of what constitutes the good life has never changed, although my understanding of how to get there changes continually. I believe, and always have, that the vast majority of the population deserve more than they currently have. I believe that we deserve to live in a better environment than we currently do. And much of my work has focused on this over the years, on improving the environment rather than conserving it or sustaining the present. I believe that everyone should have the basics of good food, plentiful clean water and heat, etc., but also freedom, choice, access to the latest technologies, entertainment, and free time to enjoy the better things in life. Now, in the early 80s, I thought all of that was possible and that none of it was inconsistent with an environmentalist perspective. For 25 years or so, I thought the opposite. Now, I think that those of us who do believe in a better future for humanity can work with the more progressive elements of what's been dubbed new environmentalism and incorporate their ideas into new forms of humanistic transformative politics. So let's engage.
Let's engage. Thank you, Casper. Yeah, again, got an eye before the red card. So, there you are, Ben. We have vision of cooperation, reaching out hands, all of us going forward to a better life and a better environment. You have 5 to 7 minutes.
That's a tough challenge. You may not have noticed, but on Friday was World Vasectomy Day. And the Royal Institution in Australia, whose initiative this is and whose motto is bringing science to people and people to science, decided that there isn't enough awareness in the world about vasectomies. And so they declared that men all over the world will dedicate their vasectomy to planet Earth in a worldwide first vasectomy-a-thon. The main event of this was a live webcast of volunteers undergoing the procedure, followed by an equally nauseating discussion led by neo-Malthusian Paul Ehrlich. So I think World Vasectomy Day is interesting for two reasons. First, it should be obvious that vasectomies are not going to save the planet, if the planet even needs saving, but that saving the planet is a vehicle for some other agenda. And there's no real basis for giving what I think is essentially a very private decision, not just public significance, but global significance. And science used to be a morally neutral thing, and a way to discover the material world, but now it wags its fingers at people saying, you know, you really ought to have the SNP. And this takes me to my second point, that this epitomizes, I think, the old environmental perspective, that you can elicit from people a radical change in their behavior or obedience by appealing to ecological crises which are beyond their comprehension. And this isn't just new to individuals in a reproductive sense, it sterilizes politics, people's capacity to choose their own future. And I think this is what what I believe environmentalism actually is, but which I don't think new environmentalists have properly overcome. Environmentalists have emphasized that it is the science which underpins their political ideas, that there is no alternative to them if we want to survive, and this demands a suspension of normal politics, the premise being that democratic forms of political organisation aren't sufficient to manage our relationship with the environment to avoid some catastrophic consequence or other. So on the environmental perspective, the parameters of these decisions are typically, about the future, are typically set by scientific committees, such as the IPCC, and implemented by technical committees, such as the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change. But the adequacy of these institutions aren't the subject to debate, and their legitimacy hasn't been tested by democratic processes. And I think that should make us suspicious that what's going on here, as with World Vasectomy Day, isn't as simple as reading off what is to be done from the scientific evidence. To criticise the political arrangement or to question it is to deny the science, to be irresponsible, to be unethical or motivated by profit or ideology. And I think that should make us even more suspicious, because it looks to me more like moral blackmail than reason. And so the main development I think that new environmentalism has offered seems to be the realisation that the policy cart was put well before the technology horse, and attempting to backpedal away from industrial life just isn't going to work. People aren't going to accept it, and agreement about it is simply too difficult to achieve. So I think now we can see a lot of revision of old environmentalism's objections to nuclear, to GM, and to lower carbon fossil fuels like natural gas as more pragmatic solutions to environmental problems. And there seems to be at last a recognition that dependence on catastrophic stories of mankind standing on the precipice has not been only counterproductive. These stories have lacked a basis in science at all. In other words, science has not been able to carry the weight of what I think has been expected of it to make moral, political and economic arguments work. And so now we see questions about the UN and IPCC's search for global agreements and whether or not they are fit for purpose. But I think the newer attempts to overcome the impasse of clunky, top-down global policies and statements that exaggerate the extent of environmental change suffer from two main problems. And the first is practical. Like skeptics and so-called climate change deniers, new environmentalists lack the institutional muscle that old environmentalists have. So when faced with the sheer volume and momentum of climate and environmental policy making, correcting mistaken views of the science has zero effect. And I'm thinking here, for example, of Obama's recent State of the Union address, which contradicted flatly the scientific consensus on the relationship between climate change and extreme weather events. And so I think it's naive to think that the problems of debates about the environment can be resolved by simply locating the best science and emphasizing the best technical response to them. More policy and more technology and more criticism of ideology doesn't really correct the problem. The second problem then is that new environmentalism doesn't take a sufficiently critical view of the development of global organizations that are intended to deal with environmental problems and what they might be a response to. I'll try and wrap up with a few indications of where I think a criticism might begin. First, I think we need a much deeper and more historical view of the context of environmentalism's development. On the words of Nick Stern, author of the influential Stern Review, policy making is usually about risk management. And so I think we need to be asking questions here about when politicians became simply policymakers and when politics became about nothing more than managing risks. And so in the late and post-Cold War era, the end of history was discussed yesterday in a session on sustainability. It seems increasingly difficult for politicians to connect with the public with positive ideas about the future. And we've seen politics descend instead to managerialism. Second, I think we need to consider the possibility that the needs of this form of politics precede the development of environmental science. So in the 1970s, we were assured in the wake of Club of Rome's reports that computer models predict with certainty that civilization would have ended by the year 2000. And so to a greater or lesser extent, the determinism of that model of society's interactions with the natural world persists in climate models and much more in estimates of the likely impact of climate change on the human world. And these models have been shown to be deeply problematic, but their political power remains. And the environment has become, unfortunately, an encompassing narrative which seems to be able to explain social phenomena such as poverty and inequality, which can be resolved simply by adjusting our emissions. Finally, I think, and in order to understand the real extent of environmental problems as they are, we need for a moment to put the science to one side, to first understand what is being expected of it, and to interrogate the presuppositions of environmentalism and science rather than taking those claims at face value.
Thank you, Ben. Squeaked in within time. Good. Doing well today. All the speakers so far have kept time. I wonder if we can get to the end of my chairing and keep that true. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I'm going off.
Okay, fair enough, Mark. Off you go.
All right, hi everyone. I'm probably one of those new environmentalists that this session is named after. I have indeed hung out with Stuart Brand and Ted and Michael a fair amount over the last few years, but I don't think I accept the label, actually. I don't feel part of a movement which is distinguishable on any obvious lines from old environmentalism. And actually, I know from personal experience, there's an enormous amount I disagree with Stuart and Ted and Michael and all the rest of them on. So I think where I part company from the orthodox environmentalism is a slightly different delineation, actually, which I'll go into in a minute. But I think we're in a different world now from how things were when I first became an environmentalist in my early 20s, back in the mid-1990s. At that point, environmentalism seemed like a very sort of united force, which was quite homogenous. I don't want to oversimplify, but it knew what it stood for, and it stood for quite a lot of things I think I would characterize now as fairly limits to growthy and fairly romantic, and to a certain extent reactionary and backward-looking. And I think some of the tensions within that have now begun to come out and have, to a certain extent, pulled the movement apart and in several different directions. In the summary for this, nuclear power and GM technology, GMOs, are mentioned. And I think they are, I mean, these are two issues that I've campaigned on vigorously for several years now. And I think they are highly symbolic, but they're also extremely real. You know, we, in my opinion, we need GM foods to feed the world sustainably over the next few decades, and we need nuclear power to power the world with low-carbon energy sustainably over the next few decades. So they are much more than merely symbolic issues which have divided the movement. So I think where I perhaps a party company from the likes of, I don't know, to name some institutional, professional environmental groups, the Greenpeaces and the Friends of the Earth, is that I would characterize my attempts at environmentalism as being more science-based on those issues in particular. So I would say that Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace do not have an evidence-based perspective on GM and nuclear, but I think they do on climate change to a large extent, although how one interprets that in terms of your degree of catastrophism, which I think was mentioned earlier, is a very valid question, given what the actual science, as perhaps best defined by the IPCC, is actually saying. You won't find the word catastrophic in any of the IPCC reports, of course. This is a matter of interpretation and is highly subjective for that reason. To come back to what you were saying about planetary engineering and the sort of hubristic aspect of this, in my book, The God Species, which was named after Stuart Brand's quote, I accepted it as the starting point that we are in this new geological era of the Anthropocene. So the Holocene is over. We're now in a new geological era, which is named after our species because we are, to a large extent, the most powerful geophysical agent on the planet, and indeed the most powerful agent of evolution. We apply more selective pressure to most of the higher level species on the Earth than any natural forces do. So planetary engineering is a de facto reality. That's what we're doing. We've pumped CO2 up to 400 parts per million, higher than it's been for 3 million years. We are changing the temperature of the planet. All of the forcing factors which are identified by the IPCC, the radiative forcing elements, whether they're negative like sulfate aerosols or whether they're positive like methane and CO2, are anthropogenic. So these are human levers on the planetary temperature or the Earth system, which are very clear, and thereby give us the decision, assuming we can take a decision on a species level, of what temperature we want the planet to be. So the idea that we can not geoengineer is, I think, a fallacy, because we are geoengineering. The question really is one of intent, and whether the outcome is one which is unintentional and haphazard, or whether it's one which is more determined because we've made a decision about where we want to be at the end. And that's, I've had a lot of experience as a negotiator in the UNFCCC. I acted when I was advisor to the president of the Maldives in that institution for far too long, and endured many, many sleepless, miserable nights of total failure, precisely because this was a site of such delicate and intense negotiation between such different perspectives. The Indians, for example, would never agree with the Maldivians. The Maldivians are trying to save their country from sea level rise. The Indians are trying to develop their nation and get out of poverty on behalf of 1.5 billion people. There was a very different and very colliding perspectives, which entirely came to the fore, and it's because of those collisions that the UNFCCC has made so little progress. So I wouldn't characterize it as being some kind of vehicle where there's a particular policy perspective which is being carried forward. I don't think that's the case at all. In terms of limits to growth, I think obviously that was wrong, and it was wrong not just in terms of the way the modelling was done, but wrong in terms of the conceptual framework I think that they came out of. And I think it was a very ideological project. I think they had a pretty good idea of what they wanted to demonstrate, and they built the models around it, which is often the case. I would more agree with the geographer Earl Ellis, who says that human history is about the transcendence, actually, of ecological boundaries which have previously been considered to be hardwired. And people sometimes ask me what the world's carrying capacity is. Well, if we're hunter-gatherers, the carrying capacity is probably about 50 million globally. If we are in an advanced industrialized civilization, it's clearly 7 billion and counting, because we are not in a catastrophe, despite the fact there's some very clear negative environmental trends, of which climate change is one. So I think actually a more useful conceptual framework is the planetary boundaries one, which I used in the book. Although I differ actually from some of the scientists, that we have different ideological perspectives. Some of them see them as constraining. Some of them see them as a room for further growth. And of course, the distinction really is about technology. It's about how efficiently you use these. You use the resources, because even if you consider there to be a fixed physical limit of CO2 in the atmosphere, which was suggested at 350 parts per million, so where we were in about 1970, for the planetary boundaries group, how we get there, of course, depends on the technology. It doesn't mean to say we have to switch off the lights and go back to a pre-industrial civilization, much as some Greens might like it. Hence the nuclear. We've got no fundamental thermodynamic shortage of energy on the planet. If you look at fission, fusion, and even solar power and some of the renewables, there's enormous capacity for future growth and to come in within the climate change planetary boundary at the same time. So the overall challenge, I think, for us is dematerialization and decarbonisation, and some combination of technological change and lifestyle change will come into that. But I do feel that the more conventional environmental ways of looking at these things are no longer relevant. Actually, I think to a certain extent that the leaders of the environmental movement are stuck in a paradigm of the past. And I think we need to move forward, and I think we need to have more debates like this and just be more open-minded, really, about where each other's coming from, and accept that we don't, however strong and self-righteous we feel about our view of the world, none of us are necessarily right. In fact, we weren't right. I certainly have been wrong a number of times, and I expect to be again. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. okay, listening to everybody here, I would never have said that I was an environmentalist particularly. I've always been much more interested in humans. But on the other hand, obviously, I don't want to live in a polluted, unpleasant planet. And so now, given the range of opinions and views and visions of the future I've just heard, I'm starting to think, well, maybe if it's that wide, maybe I am an environmentalist. And if so, does the word environmentalist even have a meaning anymore? Is it a useful term to use? Should we, I mean, obviously people are still using it, but will we have a more fruitful discussion about the future and about what we want to do in the future if we actually try and move on from the term? So I'd like to throw that back to all of you, really. Is the term environmentalist even still useful? If so, what does it mean?
Yeah, I'll have a go. I don't tend to use the term. I don't ever like it associated with myself, but the reasons for that are probably complicated. But the reason I mentioned Darwin is that I use that as a trigger for a particular change in how humans understood their place in the world through the course of the second half of the 19th century. You could say we're still actually coping with that dramatic change in our order, place in the order of things. And I'm interested in the way that climate change particularly, but I'd add in the way we think about extinction and biodiversity loss as really revising again and extending that idea that we're human animals rather than some sense set apart. What people then do with that philosophically can sometimes be frustrating and I think weak. But the phrase Anthropocene has gained ground in the last few years, and actually I think in using that phrase we need to be quite careful to not take it as read, but actually inhabit it and shape its different meanings. And in that sense, we're all in the Anthropocene now is maybe a more helpful frame than we're all environmentalists now.
Okay, what about this side of the table? I mean, what does environmentalist mean today? Does it mean anything?
Probably not, because I think most people would put themselves in that camp. It's been mainstream for a very long time, so I think it's become less meaningful over time. But I mean, for me, in the early 80s, when it wasn't so mainstream, I was quite happy to call myself an environmentalist, as well as lots of other things, because I didn't see that as in contradiction to any of my other thoughts about human beings and so on. But as it became more mainstream and all that stuff about all the stuff that was wrong really came to the fore, I would have nothing to do with the term. So I think the term changes its meaning at different times, and perhaps it's changing its meaning again now. I'm not sure. I would like to just pick up on this thing about us being back among the animals, though, because I think quite the reverse. Animals don't do research and understand climate change, and animals don't have the ability to recognise that we've got an impact on the planet and to act on it. So to me, that doesn't make sense at all.
Just to check, Casper, you're suggesting we're not animals?
No, I'm suggesting that human beings are not like any other animal on the planet, in that other animals cannot do research and cannot understand these things or act on them.
Okay, great, good. I love it when a good schism opens up early in the session. Ben, are we all environmentalists now?
I've always thought, the point was made earlier, environmentalism has always been a constellation of ideas, some of which are advanced consciously and some of which just sort of happen by default. And I think the way I try and characterise it is to, certainly in terms of political environmentalism, is to posit a need for institutions that are essentially outside of democratic control is a very broad and general definition of it. So, I think that's what we've seen in attempts to build the IPCC and UNFCCC, and then at the EU level and the UK level we have committees on climate change, and they don't respond to public discussions about whether the environment should be a priority. And so I think it's an inherently problematic phenomenon in that respect. But I think nobody wants pollution. Nobody wants there to be climate change. But I think they probably do deserve to have a discussion on how to approach those problems that's being denied. And
So you seem to be suggesting a very historically specific definition, which is not actually anything to do with what you think about the environment, but which is entirely to do with your attitude to politics more generally, and how we should approach things politically and socially, rather than what the problem is and what the answer is. Is that what you're saying?
oh yeah, I mean, I think there are cascades of assumptions that sort of open up when we try and sort of pin those things down. So I guess that there's a presupposition when you say that the environmental problems are such that they're beyond the understanding of people, ordinary people, such that we couldn't sort of take a vote on it, and we can't have a public debate on it. And I think Joe's point about animals refers here, and it's true. You know, if you take the view that we are animals, and you probably do take the view that democracy isn't the best way to sort of manage cleaning up the cage that we're in.
Did you hear that? Yeah, he just called you a dictator, Joe. It's only fair to let you come back on that before I come to Mark.
I'm sorry. Look, we're 7 billion animals, and most of us happen to live in democratic systems, and I'm expecting to live with one, you know, through the rest of my life. That is, of course, the context in which every government in the UN system has been involved in, most of them democratically elected, a system that results in the UNFCCC. It is delivered by a UN process, most of which has been supported by democratically elected governments. And just, you know, it's worth logging a bit of the polling on climate change. From the early 90s, between 40 and 60% of the population have been concerned or very concerned. The statistics more recently leave the figure at somewhere between 60 and 70%, and that's now including the developing world. The vast majority of human beings are aware of climate change science, and that itself relates to the fact that we've got a lively politics around it. Do we have a lively enough politics going in the right direction? Well, I mean, that's what we're going to spend the next half an hour on, you know.
Okay, I'm sure you'll want to come back at some point. So, Mark, how would you define environmentalism? Is it even still useful? If so, is it about your political attitude to people or the environment or what?
Well, the label is often used to imply certain opinions on those things, and I use the label as a self-descriptive term precisely because I want to provoke some discussion about this. I call myself an environmentalist because when I see headlines about, GM golden rice was destroyed by environmentalists, I think, well, they don't represent me. I'm a pro-golden rice environmentalist because I want to see something done about the vitamin A deficiency problem, which kills 6,000 children per day, you know. So I think the conventional narrative of what environmentalism stands for, I think, is what I'm trying to challenge, and I think increasingly is being challenged. And I just think I would quite like environmentalism to disappear as a concept, actually, because I think it's too black and white, it's too them and us, it's too Manichaean, and a lot of people who do describe themselves as Greens or environmentalists. I mean, say the Green Party, which obviously does have the G word. I think the ideology of the Green Party I disagree with fundamentally. I'd rather vote Tory than Green, even though I would describe myself as an environmentalist, because I disagree with so much of what it stands for. So these things are much more open, perhaps, than they used to be. And just on the animals thing, I mean, how can this even be a debate? Of course we're animals. Of course we evolved from the biosphere. We didn't come from some extraterrestrial source, but we have evolved a tool-making prowess, which is far and above anything that any animal ever came close to in the past. I mean, crows can pick at anthills with sticks or whatever, but you know, here we are using amplified sound, living in a civilization of 7 billion people, and we have developed a self-consciousness which no animal clearly has done before, and obviously that gives us both the ability and, I would argue, the responsibility to tackle some of these fundamental questions.
Marvellous. Okay, we've now got approximately half an hour, so I'm going to come out to yes, there go the hands.
Thanks a lot. I'm slightly half and half about this, because on one level I really like what Mark's saying, and I'm very happy to go off and live in a techno-utopia with you. But on the other side, I do think if we all kind of running into the evidence-based middle ground, there could be potentially some problems. So the example that I'll give is Mark Henderson's Geek Manifesto, which I think is a really good book for about 2/3 of it, but does have some problems in it. His discussion on environmentalism basically says the environmental movement needs a clause 4 moment, and so we need to become evidence-based, and people like Mark are kind of leading the way, whereas people like Paul Kingsnorth are, kind of Luddites and stuck in the mud. But the thing with Paul Kingsnorth is I fundamentally disagree with him, but he does have an impassioned political view that human civilization is a very bad thing. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to have, and you can have a political disagreement over it. So I think that we need to be a bit careful of kind of going too far down, saying that certain things are inappropriate because the evidence shows that they're wrong, if you see what I mean. That's possibly a bit garbled, but...
This isn't quite directed to Mark, but what would be what do you think the process is of anyone shifting from being an old environmentalist, predominantly sort of ideological, to one where it's a more focus on sort of technical issues? Was it a critical interrogation of evidence and the science and going, oh, actually, this technology is pretty good, or this isn't so much of an issue? Or was it an interrogation of the politics and philosophy of environmentalism? I mean, it can be both, but what would be... I'd be really interested to see what was more pressing in developing that shift of, particularly Mark or other people you may know who are new environmentalists, inverted commas.
Good question. Is it ideological or technological?
It's a question about evidence. It's a genuine question that I can only ask in a forum like this. As a student in the 1980s, I was taught by a man called Stan Openshaw, who's the man who worked out that half of us would die in the event of a nuclear war. He wrote a book called Nuclear Power, Siting and Safety. What he didn't put in the book was what he told his students, was that if you really wanted to cause trouble, this is how you blow a power station up. And if you really want to cause trouble, this is how you take a light aircraft and fly it into Sellafield. My question is there an honest scientific debate out there about the real safety of nuclear power from terrorism? Is it possible to have it without giving people the idea of how they do this? Thank you.
Okay, bold question. Yes, man with the microphone.
Caspar, I have a question for you. I'm not sure you're quite right to say that climate change has tended to dominate the debate in the last 10 or 12 years in contrast to pollution and resource depletion. I appreciate the point you make, but I wonder whether we're up to the minute enough, because what I notice is no matter how many new oil discoveries are made off Angola, in the Indian Ocean and elsewhere, it's actually resource depletion that's coming back now in the shape of the circular economy. The circular economy is advocated by Ellen MacArthur, who's clearly a professional in the field, being a yachtswoman, and McKinsey. And I think the fact that the emphasis most recently, given the moderation in temperature increases, which I don't believe is anything to write home about, but given the public perception of a more slowly warming planet, McKinsey and other people have exactly moved to this technological solutions to perceived environmental problems by advocating that we do a sort of upmarket German high-tech recycling of everything, and there's no waste at all, and everything becomes circular. I think that's the thing that's being promulgated by the Royal Society of Arts and by many government departments now. So I wondered if you'd come back on the circular economy. Can I just end by saying, I'm evidence-based. All my life, I've been evidence-based, and I have the right evidence, and Joe and I suspect Mark have the wrong evidence. So as long as we're clear about that, we can all be evidence-based, for the rest of our lives, and I wish you a happy civilization.
On the question of why did people change, I know it's to the panel, but I just have my own thoughts. I mean, having read the Nordhaus book, I got the impression, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was the dishonesty and the hysteria and predominantly the sense of paralysis that came out of the environmental movement that provided the impetus for the new one. This is really a question for Mark. I mean, I like what you said, Mark, and you sort of described the different elements of the ideology of environmentalism: technocratic, depletionist, Malthusian, romantic. There's one thing in this sort of assessment of your own movement that seems to be slightly missing. And it's the sort of psychological. I would say the new environmentalism has this sort of obsession with psychology as well. So if you look at Edward O. Wilson's work, the idea that the reason that we suffer from mental illness and a sense of estrangement in society is because we are alienated from nature. I think that's an incredibly powerful idea in terms of the new strands of environmental thinking. And if we can't challenge that, which is a very direct attack on human subjectivity, it doesn't matter how much you want to do something and challenge the paralysis that's associated with environmentalism, we won't be able to act, because the association of humanity with animals, with brain science, and with psychology is probably one of the most dangerous strands of contemporary environmentalism.
My question's not so much about the theories of it. I wouldn't say I'm massively concerned in terms of climate change. Not concerned, it's just I really don't know enough about the subject, and it's too academic, and that's double standard. Anyway, I want to get to it. What I've got to say is there was talks on the panel about how it's undemocratic, the way the movement's going, or when you talk about clashes between now fracking. One problem I suggest the environmental movement have, whatever you want to call yourselves, is that you're seen as the enemies of the poor. Not just in other countries, but in this one. So green subsidies are massively under attack now precisely because they raise energy prices. Fracking, opposed by people who are Greens in many cases or call themselves environmentalists, obviously means that energy prices for people who are very poor and, you know, instead of freezing to death in their homes, could actually have heating, are fracking's not supported by people who call themselves environmentalists. So I would say, what can the Green movement do, or do you accept that there's a problem among environmentalists that you are seen as enemies of poor people? And also, on the anti-democratic side, would you advocate, as perhaps I would, in terms of the local environment and quality of life, not having it run by the state, but having it mutualised and be cooperatively owned by the people who live there, so they actually feel an ownership over their environment and care, as opposed to it being a purely academic discussion by middle-class people who don't live in those areas?
Yeah, I think the chair touched something very interesting, which is environmentalism still about the environment? Example, Spain, spending 8 billion every year on solar and wind energy. Of course, it's not their money, it's EU money. But anyway, if they keep doing this for the next 20 years, they will delay global warming for 3 days. Kyoto, it's never going to be implemented. But even if it were implemented, it would delay global warming for 5 years in the course of a century. Second example, very quickly, the new recycle bins, the ones that whenever I have a tuna kind of can, I have to go to the garden and throw it in one of the 5 new bins. So there is a lot of evidence from various city councils that actually it hasn't worked. Actually, it hasn't kind of improved. We don't recycle more with them. But yet, city council after city council adopts these new recycle bins. So if it's not about recycling more, is it about what? Is it a good practice? Is it about kind of imposing a new morality or something? Because to me, it doesn't seem like being for the environment.
Okay, lots of points from the audience. So, panel, obviously, don't feel you all have to answer every point. Mark, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'd probably better address the nuclear power and terrorism point, or that man there's going to shout at me, I can tell. I think if you flew a light aircraft into a nuclear power station, you'd do a lot less damage because of the shielding than if you hit one with a tsunami, such as happened in Japan on March the 11th, 2011. So from that situation, which led to 3 really catastrophic meltdowns of the cores of 3 boiling water reactors and the release of a large amount of volatile fission products, we know we have a pretty good real-world case study of what the worst is that can happen, at least of a Western-built reactor, so park Chernobyl for one moment. The human impact, because of the evacuation and some of the procedures were fairly successful, is that there have been no fatalities caused by radiation. There have been no clear injuries either caused by radiation. So in terms of the human impact, the real damage is the 80,000 people who are still displaced from their homes because of the fear of returning to an area which is more radioactive than it was before. Now, obviously the question is whether that lingering radioactivity is sufficient to do actual damage to you or to be carcinogenic. And the evidence there is very unclear. And certainly people are much more scared of radiation than the scientific evidence suggests they need to be. I mean, you're probably more likely to develop cancer through particulates living in a busy city than you are through the extra radiation of living in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. But the statistics there are sufficiently uncertain that you can't prove that to people, and people's sense of fear, I suppose, is something that it's a deep cultural and psychological thing, and at a certain level you have to respect it. The way that the evidence points is sufficiently controversial on that I can't say I would want to go and live there personally with my son Tom, who's down there now. In terms of on the top right there, you mentioned Paul Kingsnorth. I should just say he was the best man at my wedding, and we were very close friends. So but we're now in a situation where we don't talk to each other because we have such distinct worldviews, and it is a worldview thing. I think he would say he's evidence-based, to address the gentleman there, just as much as I would say I'm evidence-based. So yes, to a certain extent, these things are subjective, and I can throw my scientific consensus at his scientific consensus and see who wins. But but really, I know what divides us is a worldview issue. He has I would say, a more poetic, I would characterize it as a romantic, in fact, I would characterize it negatively as misanthropic worldview. I don't see human civilization as a bad thing. He does. Well, that's up to him. He accuses me of seeing the world through graphs and spreadsheets, and, to some extent I accept that. So I think absolutely that's an ideological distinction. And to have an evidence-based worldview, I mean, we've got Fiona Fox there from the Science Media Centre. Wave your hand, Fiona. The whole point of what Fiona's doing with the Science Media Centre is to try to get a more evidence-based perspective into the media on major scientific issues. And I would quite like to see the same thing happen with the discussion about environmentalism. But obviously these things it depends on the different opinions of experts, and how you negotiate these things is something you don't have to deal with every day. So these things are always going to be challengeable. Mental illness and separation from nature, I'm not sure I buy that actually. I suspect, and I don't have any evidence, but I suspect if you went to traditional rainforest societies, they've got mad people just as much. Whether they're statistically there at the same level as ours, I don't know. I really don't know.
Okay. Joe, do you want to...
Yeah, I'd like to pick up is it Peter's point about evidence? And, James. And Nikos, your point about the political economy of recycling boxes. And relate the two. The first point about you're evidence-based, I'm evidence-based, we're both evidence-based, my evidence is bigger than yours. One of the problems we've walked into, and I think the narrow spaces of media debate, the really difficult 800 words or 2.5-minute piece that is the main kind of bridge to knowledge for most people, has delivered us into a problem, which is that I think that many in the environmental research community who wouldn't consider on the whole themselves environmentalists in the sense of belonging to a movement, found themselves trying for a kind of route one, an easy route to communicating the seriousness of the work they were doing around global environmental change issues. They narrowed and shortened what they were up to. They started to use phrases like the IPCC consensus or the science is finished. Completely inappropriate. None of them thought that. It was completely misrepresents the practice of science, and of course stops it being interesting apart from anything else. And that's why I use this playful phrase, an inconvenient risk assessment. I think it's important to understand the IPCC process as an incredibly ambitious review process that seeks to hand across the table a risk assessment. And then there's a process of risk management, which involves governments, as I say, most of them democratically elected, represented through the FCCC process. Now, there is inevitably a border area, and there are some disciplines that cross that border, economics, social sciences particularly. But nevertheless, the scientists have been involved in a risk assessment. They've done their best. They've handed it across the pass. They're mostly professionals who've found themselves where they are because they're nothing more than curious. Anyone suggesting they're after money has never been to a university car park apart from anything else. Now, once you've done the risk assessment, you've handed it over and we're engaged in risk management, we are struggling with the question of how we transform the political economy of energy in a relatively short space of time. And I think it's an empty caricature of the environmental policy debate to suggest that someone somewhere, probably in Brussels, has written a device that we will all have to live by. I think, humanity is on a drunkard's walk, and we're doing our best to make sense of how to respond to this. And I'm with Mark on the critical importance of all of us being willing to open ourselves to critique, open ourselves to changing our mind. But one thing personally I don't think I'm going to change my mind about in the next 15 years, and that's the importance of us all contributing to the risk management process. I don't know whether that means you'll end up with lots more bins, but I do think it's more important the price we're all paying for carbon.
Ben?
I took this point about the psychologization, or for want of a much better word, of the climate debate or the environmental debate being part of the. I don't think it's part of the new environmentalism as we've conceived it in the blurb. I think that is definitely an emergent thing. I don't think that's necessarily the same thing as people who are now arguing for nuclear. But I think it's worth discussing as a new phenomenon. And so there's been a number of attempts to diminish critics of environmental policy or of climate policy in academia and very much in very, very, very public attempts to sort of say there's something wrong with the brains of people who would deny or question climate change. That's quite revolting. And I'm talking in particular about some of the research from Cardiff University and the work of Stefan Lewandowski, they've attempted to draw lines connecting what they call conspiracy ideation to climate change skepticism, and not really felt any resistance within the academy to those ideas that really belong in Soviet Russia, or worse, perhaps. The worst one. I think that raises questions. All of their own. Never mind whether is climate change happening or not. And then I think this ties in to a greater or lesser extent this kind of the Geek Manifesto stuff. Which I haven't spent too much reading on, but there's this kind of emphasis on evidence and science and engagement and communication, which sort of seems to not really realise people aren't engaging. They're not really receptive to the communication. And I wonder, it's difficult to know whether the attempts to communicate are happening because people aren't engaged, and because politicians find it quite difficult to formulate policy. So I think there was another question there. I think, is environmentalism still about the environment? No, I think it's quite, in many respects, leaving aside the problem of climate change, in many respects it's an attempt to accumulate power away from democracy, not necessarily out of some conspiracy, or not necessarily out of some nefarious purpose, right? But just because it's quite difficult for democracies to proceed these days.
I'm evidence-based as well, I should say. But,
I'm evidence-based too.
Picking up on this thing about is environmentalism still about the environment? There's the still bit. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it ever was really. I think old environmentalism never was evidence-based and was always somewhat about a dim view of humanity. But you've got the different branches of environmentalism. It's very complex historically. If you look at the CPRE, for example, that was all about keeping the oiks out of the countryside originally. So that's coming from a very conservative tradition. And then you look at some of it, which was about a critique of industry polluting and poor people suffering from that. That sort of came from a left perspective, where you had this weird mishmash of stuff that was always part of what environmentalism was. So although in some ways it seemed to have a clear ideological perspective, in other ways it didn't have one at all. But certainly the idea that humans are a problem was sort of always part of it. Just think about the technical solutions thing and the question of geoengineering. I liked what you said about geoengineering. I think you're dead right. We are geoengineering, and to me, that's that's the whole point about why it makes sense to then take a rational approach to geoengineering as opposed to just doing it by accident, which is what we generally do. But actually, environmentalists, whatever that may mean, do still shy away from the idea of actively trying to intervene to affect the climate, other than reducing emissions, which everybody promotes. And I think that reflects something, and that comes back to this idea of human hubris, which does still run through the discussion and is really problematic. On the resource depletion thing, I think that's, some environmentalists, like I say, a lot of what we call environmentalists have never been evidence-based, and especially those who talks about running out of resources have never been evidence-based. The limits to growth, the goalposts have always moved. Right from day one, we knew there was more oil than they were saying was left, and now we know there's 5 times more than that, and that's without fracking, and so on. But that's never actually altered the mindset that says resource depletion's there. But that's not the main framework in which environmentalism is discussed today. And I think there are assumptions, I think, in the circular economy and recycling and all that stuff that, again, have always just run through one branch of that thought, and that will always be there and won't go away, whatever the evidence is, I suspect.
Right.
Does that? I don't know if that answers the question.
We have less than 10 minutes left, and I'd really like to take everybody.
I just wanted to come back to the, we're all environmentalists now type, and one of the themes still, an overhang from old environmentalism definitely still seems to me to be the whole idea of people having to change their behaviour. That's one thing that hasn't altered. And I'm wondering, is there a connection? By the way, I think it's a disingenuous point to say that because the UN's climate change body has happened with the agreement of democratic elected governments, that it's somehow itself an emanation of democracy. That I dispute. But I also think that that's still the problem, the abiding problem with the environmentalism and its relationship to the public, and that it doesn't really seek to hear their views, but still considers imposing behavioural change on them. What are your thoughts on that?
Just quickly, I disagree that this all evidence is equal. My evidence definitely is bigger than all of yours. And I think we should say that. We should have the debate. But my main objection to the environmentalist movement has always been that they are scared to have the real debate. They are scared to put forward their world vision, their critique, their values. And, they're against GM and nuclear and all these things because of values, because of ideology, because of a worldview. But they argue it on the basis of science. They say we should be against GM because it's dangerous, because it kills you. They say we should be against nuclear because of the dangers. So they are not honest. And I think we should have the honest debate, but I don't think that we should accept them misusing and dressing up their ideology. I have to say, Monbiot is an exception to that. I have to give him credit for that. He does argue his worldview. He says, I would eat GM, drink it, sleep in it. I object to it because we shouldn't go there just because we could. We should go back. We should stay in this kind of world. And good for him. Let's have that debate and not misuse the science.
I was talking to a science broadcaster recently. I think Timandra was there, and I said that I would rather fry in a democracy than survive in a non-democracy. I'd rather fry in a world that had regard for national sovereignty than survive in a world that didn't. I was being slightly facetious. I don't think those are the options that confront us. But I wasn't being entirely disingenuous either. And I want to put this to the panel in relation to their worldview and exactly what kind of a premium they place upon democracy in relation to the climate. I think one of the reasons for the new environmentalism phenomenon might be because it's really hard to sustain the rhetoric that countries, much less the whole world, should be organised on a war footing in which democracy is suspended or eroded in various ways. It's really hard to sustain that, although some people are still arguing for it. What do the panel think?
Whatever you say, that there's not the investment for wind farms. The government is having a big problem right now finding this 110 billions for the wind farms. Whatever environmentalists say, without private investors investing in this decarbonisation agenda, it just won't happen. Where's the money going to come from? You can't imagine it out of thin air, and you can't put it on people's energy bills. And it's quite interesting that The Sun started running a campaign. I'm sure nobody here has read The Sun, but that is actually running a campaign against green climate levies. And I think they might win the argument.
Okay, thank you. The previous speaker actually used to write for The Sun. Yes, here.
Yeah, mine was a continuation of that one up there. It was about the economy. And I was just asking really, Mark and everyone, isn't the new environmentalist movement, isn't it basically factoring the economy into the environmentalist movement in terms of putting the value on rainforests? It's something we haven't talked about in terms of putting the value on biodiversity, in terms of how much we want to keep, because obviously that provides us with new chemicals and new methodologies that we'd never have thought of before if it hadn't been there. So how much do we want to retain? How much is that worth? The amount of money that we want to put into real waste management and, of course, atmospheric security.
Yeah, the chap said it was more dangerous for a nuclear reactor to get hit by a tsunami than get hit by a light aircraft. Well, the thing is, it might be raining outside, but we don't get tsunamis in the UK. And the other thing he said is what about getting hit by a light aircraft? Well, just try starting on a stewardess on an aeroplane and see what happens.
There's been a bit of discussion, only a small bit, about the left and the right. Now, to me, a large part of the last 30 years, the cultural left and the Greens have been fellow travellers, same people, whatever. So this is the short version. Do Mark and Joe actually consider themselves of the left, or does it help you, or is it meaningless anymore? Basically, do you consider yourself still to be left-wing, I suppose?
Some of the speakers have talked about how they view themselves as being evidence-based thinkers. And at the same time, we wanted to see decisions about climate change made on a democratic basis. Does the panel think that with the state of public education about science and science knowledge, it's possible to have decisions made on a democratic basis and made on the basis of evidence, which is often very, very complex and difficult to understand for the layman? And if not, is there anything we can do to improve that process?
How do we stop environmentalist movements fragmenting into single-issue campaigns which dissipate energies?
Fantastically brief. Round of applause for that woman for being so brief. Got a quick round of applause. Okay, enough. Now, panel, you technically have a minute between you to sum... Oh, sorry. Technically have no time at all between you to sum up. So please be concise and brilliant.
I would like to start by acknowledging that this panel is unbalanced. We don't have anyone here from Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, representing the old environmentalism, which all of us to a certain extent are critiquing, even if, assuming we can decide what it is. Yeah, but I don't think you are, so I don't think that's right.
May well be they were invited and didn't
on the behaviour change issue, the techno fix objection is often raised to what I'm trying to do. Well, this is the techno fix, and actually we need people to change their behaviour. And I think there is an implicit authoritarianism in that people ought to be living the way I want them to live, and that's one of the reasons why the Greens have become obsessed with climate change. And now I do think the science is very clear that climate change is probably one of the 2 or 3 preeminent challenges facing civilization, but that doesn't predispose there to being a particular answer to it, which is comfortable to the ideological left, green left, you see what I mean. So those are 2 separate things. And this is summarised by this concept of the carbon fairy, which Futera have come up with. It's asking people in a room, would you wave a wand and get rid of climate change without any lifestyle change at all? And almost nobody puts their hands up in a conventional sort of leftish environment. People want climate change to be a way of achieving something else. I would put my hand up and I would wave that wand, which is why I support nuclear power, because it's probably the closest thing to the carbon fairy that anyone can come up with. On the issue of democracy, I don't like the war footing analogy for precisely that reason. If any decision isn't made democratically, it doesn't have my support. And for the moment in the Maldives, for example, we're having a big, I say we, but I worked for the Maldives for a long time. I wouldn't go back and work there on climate change unless it was a fully democratic system, and there's a huge difficulty with the elections being cancelled. So I wouldn't be involved in making the Maldives a carbon neutral state, which was the original objective of the democratically elected president, in an undemocratic system. So I hope that says something. On the environmental valuation issue, there is, of course, a huge debate, and this is perhaps, again, one of the major ideological fault lines here, between the concept of inherent value of nature and the more utilitarian approach of nature in as much as it can be valued in dollars and shillings and pence and whatever, because it has a value to us as humans, whether it's new drugs or even whether it's sustaining us at an ecosystem level as a species. And I don't think that can be resolved. I think if you have an idea of the inherent value of nature, that's in itself an anthropogenic concept. So I'm not sure you get to a meaningful conclusion on that. And are we of the left? I am probably a centrist, actually, because there's certain aspects of left policies which I agree. I'm very concerned about inequality in society, but at the same time, there are certain. I think market systems are by far the most efficient and useful way to distribute resources in general. Obviously, they have failures, but these kinds of things are different concepts from different areas. So I wouldn't put myself in either camp in an obvious way.
Joe?
I'm a Green Social Democrat. I am also a capitalist in the formal sense of being a shareholder in a Midlands SME and a company director. That company's been around for 158 years. I wanted to be there in another 158 years. I think that capitalism, market capitalism, is going to be an essential tool. There's nothing else around that has been able to respond to ideas and deliver change on the scale that it has. I'd like it to do that with a bit more wit in future. Now, with that in mind, I just want to go back to this phrase about the fact that we've got this tool-making prowess, and that allows me to refer to my favourite Stuart Brand book, which is called How Buildings Learn. It's a wonderful book that looks at the fact that apparently 9 out of 10, I don't believe his stats, 9 out of 10 architects never revisit the buildings they design. And he explores the lives of the buildings in the years after they've designed them. I won't go into it more than to just pull out one thought from that, which is that I think we need to learn how to look after our creatures. There haven't been many women represented on the panels I've listened to, or this one that I'm on. Most of my good ideas come from my wife and collaborator, Renata Tischtruk, and I've drawn on her writing about how we might reread the Frankenstein myth as a parable about how we need to look after our creatures. So it doesn't dictate to us what... we shouldn't have one answer to GM. It shouldn't be a binary about nuclear. Politics, policy, technology is like comedy. It's very socially, specific, contextually specific. So what Brand, I think, is trying to tell us is that we need to learn to live with our technologies, understand how they change us, and understand how we can apply them wisely in the context of our being, spectacularly clever animals. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Ben?
I'll answer Mark's point about the division here. I think if there was a representative of some of the bigger NGOs here, I think we know what they'd say, and I think Fiona alluded to that point there, and so I'll answer her point as well. The failure to put forward people's worldviews. I mean, everyone is afraid of ideology, right? Everyone wants to be evidence-based, and all right. So I agree, but even the cultural left I was referred to. No one will put their hands up and say, I believe this in spite of evidence, right? So, but I think that should raise a question of what role science is playing in society. There may be an answer there closer to home, right? What is it? And if it's to start saying, well, we should be living like this and we should be having vasectomies, then there is a problem with the role that science is playing in society, and that perhaps it should step out a bit and not to blame science or scientific institutions for a degrading of democracy, but that it does probably need further discussion. And I think that discussion is much bigger than the climate debate, and it would be a good thing actually if we could have that debate aside from the climate debate entirely, and when we do have debates about the climate, we didn't put science on one side and apparent critics or deniers, as they're called, of certain scientific theories on another. I think that's another problem entirely.
Thank you, Ben. Casper.
A couple of things, and I actually think climate change is important, but I don't think it's the biggest issue facing humanity at all. So I think that's one thing that, you know, those of us who think that should make that really clear. There's lots of other human problems that are far more important. I quite like Lomborg's approach. I think he might be classed as a new environmentalist, but again with a different approach. I mean, he actually, you know, looks at what bang for your buck you get from geoengineering and from interventions in human health and wealth and all these things, and says that's much more worthwhile than trying to reduce carbon emissions, and it makes a lot of sense. But just to finish with, really, I mean, to Andrew, you said you're an optimist. I hope I didn't come across as not an optimist, because I'm certainly an optimist too, because I believe in humanity. And I think we can solve problems, social problems and environmental problems, if we have the will to do so and the belief in ourselves.
Well, what a great note to end on. Thank you very much to all the speakers.